Well, happy Easter, happy Resurrection Day to you all. If you're just joining us, or for those of you that are listening to our podcast or you're watching online, you just tuned in, we have been in a conversation that I did not want to pause for Easter, and I wrote it some time ago, and I thought, well, let's just roll with it, all right? It's called Jesus Saves, a post-evangelical reframing of salvation. Makes me smile just to say it, all right? We have been probably 4 or 5 weeks into this now, and essentially what we are doing is we're trying to reframe the evangelical notion of salvation with what we hope is a more beautiful, broader, healing, liberating, and comprehensive understanding of this very complex idea and term that many of us and this collective have been handed called salvation. Now, we've been talking about all kinds of things. So if you're in here and you did not grow up in the church, this might be new to you. I almost want to apologize to say don't pay attention this morning because I don't want to give you something that you've never thought about before that now you have to wrestle with, all right? But for many of us, a large part of this spiritual collective, a large part of our gathering is we have, by and large, grown up in the faith. And so lots of us are rethinking a lot of the stuff we were handed. We use phrases like this: we're transcending and including. And so the idea is as we grow, because we're all growing, we're all evolving, we're all becoming better versions of ourselves. We're not who we were, and who we are is not who we will be. And so we're asking giant questions as we evolve, as we grow. What do we need to bring with us? What is it that we were handed in our traditions that we need to keep with us? So we don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's not like we're like, well, all of it was terrible. No, we transcend, we grow, but then we include all of the healthy elements. And so one of the ways that we do that is we explore things and we ask questions. And at Vinings Lake, we do sermons together a lot of times. We'll just open the floor. It's amazing. You have no idea. Now, I'm not going to do it today because there's too many guests in here, but you have no idea what's going to happen in those moments. And so one of the things we're doing is just talking about salvation. For many of us, that was the ultimate thing growing up in the church. Like by and large, the question came down to this: have you been saved? Have you heard this, right? Have you been Billy Graham? You remember Billy Graham? In my world, he was a big deal. He used to say, have you been born again? And he would say, like, the buses will wait if you need to come forward and be born again. What does that mean? What does it mean for us in 2024 here in Georgia? And so we've been talking about like Jewish understandings of that word, because all of the Old Testament and the New Testament is kind of framed in Judaism. So what did these early writers mean when they wrote that word? Turns out they didn't mean anything about what happens when you die. It's actually not in the Bible. When they used salvation, it was very literal. So their understandings of salvation was salvation as liberation from oppression. It goes all the way back to the book of Exodus. Even if you're not in church, you probably know that story of Moses. Pharaoh, let my people go. You've heard this story, right? You sang that in church. All right. The idea is that they experienced an actual liberation. So we looked at like Jewish understandings. We looked at like Greek and Gentile understandings of salvation. And then we shifted a little bit and we broke out this thing, and you've probably never seen it before, but it's called the evangelical. Have you ever, anyone, just raise your hand if you've seen this before. First of all, let me apologize, okay? And then second, if I had the money, I would pay for your therapy, because if you grew up like me, this thing right here was pretty intense. And if you're unfamiliar with it, my recommendation, well, just keep it that way, okay? But the evangelical kind of goes through these steps. Now, we had the evangelical, so we kind of shared a little bit about that, and we talked about what I was handed called original sin, which actually isn't anywhere in the Bible, but what you do have in the Bible is original goodness. And so we talked about that. We talked about what I call the ultimate childhood wound. The ultimate childhood wound is the belief that you and I were born with a childhood wound. It just isn't true. And so we talked about original goodness, and then we've been like shifting all over the place. We've talked about repentance. We talked about all kinds of things. We're heading toward John 14:6. Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. What does that mean? We need to talk about that. Baptism next week. We're going to talk about the Great Commission. Have you heard this phrase? We need to talk about missionaries, and with that comes colonization. So we're just like jumping into this conversation, okay? And today what I want to do is I want to shift from the EvangeCube. It's time to put it down. I want to go to a new thing that I was handed, and it's okay if you want to participate, you can. But how many of you in this room have ever heard of the Romans Road to Salvation? Just lift up your hand and you see. Yeah, all right. That's many of you, okay? Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Romans Road, I grew up evangelical, and I don't have it memorized, which is terrible, but I should. Essentially, it's this idea that there are like these steps that you can find strictly in the book of Romans that lead you to, quote, salvation, unquote, all right? So they'll start in Romans chapter 3, verse 10. As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. How many of you heard that one before? You know, oh, come on, people, all right? That was one of the favorites in the evangelical world. All right, Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Romans 5:8, but God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Jesus Christ our Lord. Romans 10:9 and 10, because if you confess, good Lord, I'm not going to lie, this one I'm a little bit triggered, all right? Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. Romans 10:13, for everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Now, note what and by the way, when I say evangelicals, okay, I need to say this because there's a lot of guests. I'm not picking on a particular group of people. I'm talking about me and my people. Do you know what I'm talking about? Because that's how I grew up, all right? Now, all of that said, if you notice, they start at the beginning of Romans, and then they work their way all the way to Romans 10. And they pull out these verses, and what they said was, oh, look, Paul is showing us the way to salvation. Now, all of that said, I want to do this. I want to go back to the Romans road, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you the rest of the Romans road, okay? I propose that the Romans road is pretty decent. The problem with the Romans road is that they didn't finish the trip. You understand what I'm saying? They started out at the beginning of Romans going, check it out, Romans 3, Romans 5, Romans 8, Romans 9, and Romans 10. They're like, put it in park, boom, salvation. Great. The problem is Romans doesn't end in chapter 10. And as a good Christian, don't you think we should read the whole Bible? Why do we stop at 10 when the book didn't stop at 10? No one gave me the rest of the road. I got in the evangelical car in the back seat. First of all, I didn't choose to get back there. I was just born into it, all right? They threw me back there, and they're like, hang on. And they start telling me a story while I'm on the way. They're like, hey, just heads up, I just want you to know you were born broken and separated from God. Well, thank you. I'm glad I'm here. This is great. But the good news is we have the solution, and the solution is that you need to come to this church, and here's what you need to do to get that, all right? And they kept going until finally they got to the end, and they're like, all you have to do is just, like, put your faith in Jesus, confess it, believe it, boom, you're good. They threw it in park. No one ever told me the road didn't stop there. Give me the rest of the Romans road. Where does it go from here? Like I want to know, why did we stop at mile 13 when there are more miles to go? Are you with me so far? We good? Okay. If we're not good right now, you're free to go. All right. Because where I'm about to go is some of the most mind-blowing ideas I have ever seen in the biblical narrative. All right. Now, all of that said, here's what I want to give you. Okay. I want to read the rest of the Romans road that, maybe we should say like this. I want to give you the Romans road that they never told you about, all right? They never told me about. So this is where we're going to go. Now, let me say something that you need to know before we read this text. When Paul, there are 7 undisputed letters of Paul in the New Testament, 7. One of those is Romans. So scholarship is like beyond a doubt, Romans is written by Paul, okay? When Paul uses the language of salvation, all right, which is a big term, we need to be reminded, especially if you're visiting today, you need to understand this. salvation for Paul is for God to literally come and overthrow the empire that has enslaved his people and restore justice and wholeness to creation. Okay? Salvation for Paul was not about the afterlife. This didn't come until years later in the evangelical movement. The idea of you need to be saved as a way of when I die, I can go to heaven, that's somewhat of a brand new idea. Like that is not the understanding that Paul has of salvation. When Paul talks about salvation, he's not talking about who goes to heaven. That's the wrong question. He's talking about how can God's realm or kingdom or empire come on earth as it is in heaven. He's talking about literal, concrete salvation from the Roman oppressors. This is what Paul talks about when he talks about salvation. Now, with that in mind, lock it in for a minute. Let me give you a little bit of context because I want to pick up in Romans 9. Are we feeling okay? All right, just getting warmed up. Let's go. Here we go. All right. Romans was written somewhere around 57 Common Era. All right. So if you're like me and you're like a history person, like place this. Okay. We know likely between 55 and 57, Paul wrote Romans. Paul in the New Testament is known as the apostle to the Gentiles, okay? What I'm about to read to you is found in Romans 9, Romans 10, and Romans 11. You need to know something about those three chapters. They are an extended riff. Paul is riffing. He's going on, he's basically giving a sermon and he's chased like a little bit of a rabbit. And he's like, you know what, I'm just going to go for it. And so 9, 10, and 11 must be read together. We all know by now it's incredibly dangerous to just pull a verse right out of the biblical narrative and make it say whatever we want it to say, all right? No, it's really healthy if we leave it in where it is, all right? So if you're going to read Romans 10, make sure you read 9, 10, and 11, all right? Now, Paul is writing to three different types of people. This is very important. That's why I'm bringing this, all right? Paul is writing specifically to what I would call like believing Gentiles. I'm talking about people that initially, in this moment, are somewhat excluded from the family of God, somewhat excluded from being a part of the chosen people because they were not Jewish. In the first century, you had Jews and you had Gentiles. And I don't know how to tell you this, but there might be one or two Jews in this room. But just to be clear, if you were born in the first century, 99.9% of you would not be included in the salvation experience that a lot of these writers are talking about. So when we talk about full inclusion at Bindings Lake, I want to be very clear. I'm grateful because I'm not Jewish, all right? And so the idea is that Paul is writing to this believing Gentile group, but that's not all. There were two other types of people he's writing to. Believing Gentiles and believing Jews, all right? Now this gets really interesting because the believing Jews were folks who held on to Jewish customs in Judaism, but at the same time they found Jesus to be the Messiah. And so there's like this liminal space that they found themselves in going, okay, not all of Judaism embraced this new movement that Jesus seems to be promoting, but at the same time, we want to hold on to Judaism because we find great wisdom in this, but we also know there's something about like this movement that's happening, okay? But then there's also unbelieving Jews. This is the audience that Paul is writing to. The unbelieving Jews are simply folks who followed the Torah, the 613 commandments. They would be basically people that subscribed to Judaism and that looked at the path of Jesus and they're like, no, actually we don't think that's the way. And some, not all, were actually thinking that was the Jesus movement was very heretical in the moment. Like some of the notions and ideas he said, it seemed to be very idolatrous. Even some of the followers kind of made Jesus to be God, and that felt like idolatry to some people in Judaism. So, you follow me? There are three types of people, all right? Now, this is not a good parallel, and I hope I'm not taken out of context online, but you can lean a little bit to be like, okay, you have Gentiles who essentially are like folks who just weren't included. So the marginalized, the outcast. You had these believing Jews who found themselves in the middle of all this going, there's something with this, but yet I don't want to forsake this. And then you had these unbelieving Jews who are like, that's just, it's heresy. Like, there's no way around it. The Yahweh is Yahweh, and there is no other Yahweh, all right? So there are these three humans that are at play in this particular story. Now, all of that said, here's what they're arguing about. Here's the question, okay? What makes up the people of God? Who is included in Abraham's family? And the argument was this. I'll tell you who's included. Those who have genetic inheritance. All right? So, if you are a Jew, you're in. And by in, I mean apparently God's coming to save all of his people who are oppressed. And what happened in the first century is somewhere in Rome, because he's writing to the Romans, so we're in the heart of the oppression, the heart of the greatest military superpower the world has ever seen, the Roman Empire. We're in the heart of it. And within that movement, there are these fights and splits happening. And it's really fascinating that you have this question of, well, God's coming to save his people from this oppression, but who all's going to be in that? Like, who's in and who's out? And according to a lot of Jews, they said, we'll welcome the Gentiles because they're outsiders, but if they're going to be in, they're going to have to do some things. There are some requirements. Now, I want to give you these requirements, and here they are. I'll just give you a couple of them, all right? Do Gentiles need to adopt Jewish practices to be full members? The requirements to be a, quote, child of God, to be in on the salvation, well, one of them was circumcision, all right? Now, I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to let you give your own Sunday school lesson to your kids at lunch today about what circumcision is, all right? I can tell you, you can think of it as like a rite of passage or an initiation rite, but it's the idea that basically if you were going to be a part, and there's a long history in the biblical narrative about circumcision, long history. I can tell you this, it came back down to this idea. When the Israelites didn't know who they were, when they were flailing about in exile, they had to have some things to kind of mark who they are. And this is a question or a conversation or a ritual in identity. And so to like mark who they are, they're like, well, circumcision. So if you want in, you need to be circumcised. And then there are all kinds of other things. They had dietary restrictions. Well, there's 613 commandments. So if the Gentiles want in, we're not just going to leave them out and exclude them, but if they want in, they're going to have to follow the 613 commandments. There are requirements to get in, all right? So the question is, what makes up the people of God? What are the requirements to be a child of God? What is the basis on which I am accepted? What do I have to do to be accepted? Those are the questions that Paul is addressing. Now, what Paul does with those questions is he dunks on them, all right? It's the best language I have. What I'm about to read to you, in my opinion, in the first century, would have been the most evolutionary idea these people had ever heard. And it fascinates me that it's right in the book of Romans, one of the most complicated books in all the Bible. And Paul does something in this moment that absolutely shatters the categories of in and out. All right, you ready for this? So you're like, wait, you haven't started? Nope. All right, here we go. All right. Let me read this to you. This is Romans 9. We'll start at verse 9, chapter 9, verse 30. What then are we to say? All right, so notice how Paul opens this. What then are we to say? Gentiles who did not strive for righteousness have attained it. Now pause. People would get this letter from Paul, and they would stand up in like a gathering like this, and they would read it. So just hang with me. Imagine if you had like far-right conservatives, and then imagine if you had far-left extreme liberals, and then imagine you had a group of people who were like centrist in the middle. And imagine if I stood up and I'm like, what can I say? We were taught Jesus was a Republican. Turns out he rode in on a donkey. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, do you know? Do you know what I mean? So, what then are we to say? Gentiles who did not strive for righteousness have attained it. Opening line, all the Gentiles in the church would have been like standing O. Woo! We're in, baby. I told you we're in. And you know they kind of looked at the Jews like, I told you we're in. We have attained it. Came right from the mouth of Paul. Gentiles who did not strive for righteousness have attained it. They're loving this moment. That is, righteousness through faith. But Israel, and when he says Israel, who's he talking about? Unbelieving Jews. But Israel, who did not strive for the law of righteousness, did not attain that law. Why not? Because they did not strive for it on the basis of faith, but as it were based on works. All right, let's keep going. Next slide. Moses, okay, I don't want to nerd out too much here, but Paul is doing something really clever here, really clever. Now, I know some of you are in here and you just don't like Paul. I get it. Paul has been accused of so many things, and I don't know how much of we accuse Paul for Paul actually even wrote. I do have some beef with Paul, but we'll figure all that out on the other side. Just meet me there. We'll meet him at the same time. You know what I'm talking about? Paul, we got questions, all right? But Paul does something really clever here. Paul, he uses the Torah, like the Torah, to argue his point. So he's using the text of unbelieving Jews to argue his point that Gentiles are actually included. It's mind-blowing. He says, Moses writes concerning the righteousness that comes from the law, that the person who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that comes from faith says, do not say in your heart who will ascend into heaven, that is, to bring Christ down. Or who will descend into the abyss, that is, to bring Christ up from the dead. There's your resurrection right there, okay? But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is, word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess, okay, hang with me here. If you grew up evangelical, all right, is there anything more triggering than this phrase? Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For one believes with the heart, leading to righteousness, and one confesses with the mouth, leading to salvation. Okay. By the way, that's a quote from Deuteronomy 30. Now, let's just real fast. I want to tell you what he says to the unbelieving Jews, and then I want to show you what he does right when the Gentiles think they've got it. All right? So here's the argument. Okay, first to the Jews. Paul begins his thesis by contrasting the law and faith. He uses the Torah to make his point. Now, I'm going to whittle this down for us so we get out of here a little bit early and you all think this is a great church and you come back next week. Okay, here we go. First, Paul essentially uses the Torah or the law, and let me pause here to say Paul is not against the law. Paul is not against the Torah. Okay? One of the things that's happened in our culture is, if we're not careful, we have this thing called Christian privilege, and we need to be aware of Christian privilege. And innate within some of our Christian understandings and interpretation is anti-Semitic understandings, where we look back and say, well, the Jews killed Christ, and the Jews are at fault, and No, the reality is I need you to understand this. There were no Christians in the first century, all right? This may shock you. Hang with me like, whoa, what are you talking about? That's when Christianity started. I don't know if you know this. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was a rabbi. He practiced Judaism, all right? All of these individuals you see in the Bible are Jews, most of them, and they practice Judaism, all right? That was the religion of the day. So there is no clean break. You don't have a day where you're like, that's the day Judaism ended and Christianity started. There's no clean break. Actually, what you have in this like liminal space is you have people, and they didn't know what to call themselves anymore. So check it out. In Acts, it says they just called themselves the people of the way. They're like, oh, there's just the people of the way. The way of what? The way of love? The way opposite of Caesar, the way of compassion. That's one of my favorite markings, and that's what I say about Vinings Lake. Like, what is Vinings Lake? I don't know. Maybe we're just like people of the way, a different path, countercultural than what most of us know. So Paul is not against the law. In fact, to the contrary, Paul uses the law because he still respects the law in the Torah, and he's not against it. He's saying, no, the law has its place. The Torah has its place. The 613 commandments have their place. They were necessary and are necessary to help control action. All right? I'm glad we have a law that says do not murder. Now, here's why. I don't need the law to tell me not to murder to know intuitively murder is wrong. I have graduated beyond that now. Now, there's some people, though, to be clear, Eckhart Tolle would say they're still unconscious. Do you know what I'm talking about? And it's the unconscious that I am grateful we still have this law. Do not murder. But I have to tell you, I don't wake up every morning going, well, I didn't murder today, by and large, because the law told me not to. Hopefully you have grown and evolved and you're at a place where I didn't murder today because I didn't want to. Do you know what I'm saying? Now, there are some people, hear me, where I have an inkling every now and then, and I'm a pastor, where I'm like, what do we need to do? You know what I'm talking about? Now, I wouldn't do it myself, to be clear about it, all right? But I might hire someone, you know what I'm talking about? So I'm just saying, like at some point you graduate and you realize, oh, the law is good for early stages of consciousness. But the thing about the law is it helps like control actions, but it cannot define essence. And this is a part of the problem that Paul is addressing. And so he says, the law, the 613 commandments are great. They're necessary. But I want you to know the law is something you do. When he talks about faith, he's talking about something God does. And so it begins to parallel these two. And essentially what he's doing is he's getting at the difference between doing and being. Now pause with me for a minute. Many of us have confused that. We have confused actions with essence. I'd like to say this on Resurrection Day for all of you who have messed up in life. Aren't you grateful you are not defined by your worst mistake? Some of you aren't nodding your head, and if you want us to define you by your worst mistake, please stand and tell us what you've done, all right? I am so grateful I'm not defined by my worst mistake. That is the difference between actions and essence. And here's the thing that's so critical. Actions flow from essence. And this is why I'm so adamant about how we raise our kids here. Your kids are back there. There's a jumpy thing. I don't know what's happening at this point, but I can tell you they're back there and they're in good hands. Because one of the things we're so adamant about is trying to raise a generation that doesn't have to have as many therapy sessions as we have had. Trying to raise a generation that actually doesn't have to unlearn so many toxic ideas about some monster God who's angry and has a belt and is getting ready to throw down wrath and send them to hell for the rest of their lives. We're trying to help kids raise them up to realize, actually, actions flow from essence. And this is the fundamental problem with the starting point of the evangelical faith, is that they tell you you are born broken and separated from God. I'm here to tell you I still have a word, I have a sermon, and it sounds like this. You were never born broken and separated from God. That is the ultimate lie. You were born whole and made of God. And this is a part of what we try to give these kids. And the reason that's so vital is because, I don't know how to tell you this, but if you keep looking at your kids going, you're just a rotten sinner. Hey, heads up, they will eventually line their actions up with what you keep telling them they are. So don't be alarmed if we've got a whole generation of people that are doing mass shootings. I don't know how to tell you this, and you can put the blame on whatever you want. Some people are like, it's a secularization of America. It's video games. All right, okay. How much has the church played a role in this? By telling people who they are, that runs contrary to what God actually says we are. Yeah. And this is what Paul is doing. Now, Paul does something really clever. He goes to Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, here's what he does. This is really interesting. He goes to Deuteronomy 30, and I don't have time to read all of that particular passage, but it's a mind-blowing passage. I will read verse 14 to you. He says, every word is near to you. This is Deuteronomy 30. It is in your mouth and in your heart for you to observe. Now, let me tell you what Paul is doing here. Paul is essentially inserting Christ in the place of the law. And what he says is, he kind of gives this analogy, the way Moses used to say, okay, the way that the law has come down, it's come down to you and you've meditated on it. So it's in your mouth, you meditate on it. And then it's also in your heart. So it's like you recite it, then you meditate on it. Now, here's what I can tell you about ancient Judaism and even Jews to this day. They are some of the most well-read, some of the most memorized humans you'll ever meet in your life that have memorized much of the Torah. I'll tell you why, because they practice it. Day in and day out, they meditate and recite the Torah. And many of them have this thing memorized. Now, what Paul does is something interesting. He takes this idea, the way that you recite and meditate the law, let's put Christ in the place of this law. And I'm telling you, you no longer have to do anything to be in the family of God. Those requirements that you were told, circumcision, dietary restrictions, all those things, they're all great and they have a place. They help control actions. But we need to be clear, they do not define essence. And so have at it if that's your thing. But I want you to know those requirements do not apply for admission into the family of God. Paul's argument is, no. I'm telling you that whatever happened in Christ eliminates those requirements. And so what Paul does is he plays on this. He says, okay, let's talk about the mouth and the heart, the meditation, the reciting. No. It's not that. It's actually this simple. I'm just saying confess and believe. Essentially, I broke these words down. Announce, confess, and believe or trust. So here's a beautiful idea. Here's maybe what Paul is getting at here. Instead of trying to meditate and recite and memorize all of the Torah and keep the law so you can earn yourself a place in the family of God, never works out, by the way. Never works out. And how does one measure? You know what I mean? Like, how do you measure whether or not you're in? How much good you've done? How much bad you've done? Which one outweighs the other? And then are we compared to others? Because I'll be honest, if we are, I wish I died like when Hitler died. You know what I'm talking about? Rolled in on the same day and be like, I'm good. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm good. I'm good. Like, how does it work? One outweighs the other? Paul's like, no. I'm saying announce this good news. And what is that good news? You don't have to do all these things. You can't earn your way into this identity, this family of God. And then here's what he's saying. Just trust it's true. Trust that it's true. And this is so easy to say, but so hard, isn't it? Because there's something, it feels like that's within us, and we keep trying to strive to earn our way into good standings with the divine. I mean, I see it all the time. I'm not, like, being funny or mean here, but by and large, a lot of us come to church on Easter, and I wondered if it was a real safe place. We're like, why are you here? Many of you would be like, well, my family. Some of you still have an outdated idea that in some way there's still some God up there keeping score. And this is why you're like, well, God's up there, and one day we're going to die, and so I just want to make sure when I get up there, he's like, are you in or out? And you're like, well, I mean, I went to Easter 3 times? And where is it? Is it 4 times? And I always say this to you. Some of you came last week, and if it works this way, then I would say it's the ones who come on Palm Sunday and Easter that get in. Do you know what I'm talking about? But here's what I would offer you. If that's you and you're like, I believe this, okay, then I'm saying I will see you next week. Do you know what I'm talking about? Because it's the people who come the Sunday after Easter. Now those are the true people. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. right? Like, how do we do this? Paul is just saying, what are you talking about? Look, you can't earn your way in. You're in. Whatever Paul understood in his first century world of interpreting what happened with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, he places that in the place of the law, and he's like, here's how I see it. Something happened with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and what I want you to understand in that image, I have come to understand that you cannot earn your way into this thing. You are in, and so I would say to you, like, just announce that. Announce it, and then trust it's true. And so here's what's wild. People actually start announcing it. But announcing it in the first century took a lot of courage. A lot of courage. And one of the ways that they announce it is they use this phrase, Jesus is Lord. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the first century, it was ruled by a list of Caesars. And these Caesars, much of the New Testament is like subversive literature about this empire that had them oppressed. And to make a declaration that Caesar is Lord was very dangerous. It was very dangerous because essentially what they were saying is Caesar is not. So if you say Jesus is Lord, you're essentially saying Caesar is not Lord. Now, Jesus is Lord was an affront to like the Roman Pledge of Allegiance that every Roman citizen had to proclaim when they raised their hand to imperial insignia and often shout, Caesar is Lord. You imagine that? I mean, there's something incredibly dangerous about the idea of when you stepped into a market and they all gathered and they all were about to pledge allegiance to Rome. And what do you have in that moment? Are a bunch of followers of the way going, actually, we're going to stay silent here. Our allegiance is not to Caesar. Our allegiance is to a whole new way of living. Our allegiance is to a whole different Savior. In fact, the reality is Caesar kind of claimed himself as the Savior of the world. There's no other name under which men can be saved than that of Caesar Augustus. So much of the language we hear about salvation is like subversive literature that they appropriated from the first century Roman Empire. They flipped it and said, actually, that's not true at all. The way of Caesar is the way of violence. It's the myth of redemptive violence. It promises peace, but in the end, it never really provides. But ultimately, what does provide is this new way we're seeing, and we want you to know about it. So actually, Caesar isn't Lord. Jesus is Lord. Well, that's going to work out well for you in the presence of the Roman military. Now, I want to pause here and say something that's going to be slightly political, and I also want to pause here and say something that we've done so well this Easter, and I'm about to ruin it right now, okay? I'm going to move on, and you can make your own interpretations. It's okay, we're a safe space here, but we also aren't afraid to say what I feel like needs to be brought to the room. I will tell you what Jesus never did, and you can just accept it for what it is. Jesus never, nor Paul one time stood in the midst of this. And when they said, Caesar is not Lord, Jesus is Lord, Jesus never showed up and said, guys, I'm selling a Bible, and it's God Bless Rome Bible. And here's the thing, it's got all of our like Constitution and stuff in it. And so this is what you need. There's no judgment here of what's transpiring right now. I'm telling you, in the first century, you would that would have been the most backward idea of the followers of the way. The most backward idea ever. They'd been like scratching their head going, wait, I'm totally confused about this. So like, where is our allegiance? As my friend Jonathan Merritt said, if right now you got on and said, hey Siri, what is Christian nationalism? Insert image. Yeah. What an insult to actual first century Christians everywhere who actually gave their lives living in opposition to an empire. And I'm just saying, I think we all have to be careful I mean, we're in this space right now. We all have to be careful that this movement of the way doesn't get co-opted by any political party. Are you with me? Do you want applause? Maybe? Just what? No, we don't do. Nope. No, thank you for the sitting ovation. Okay. Trust is not about something you do. Trust is about something God does for you. What Paul is saying is your identity is not based on your performance. There is nothing, you've probably heard this, but hang with me because I'm going to repeat it in just a second. There is nothing you can do to make God love you any more or any less than God does right now. So essentially, this whole first argument is right towards the Jews. And here's what Paul essentially says, and whittle it down. Paul says, God includes the Gentiles without any of your Jewish requirements. Now, first of all, pause here. That is an evolutionary leap in the first century, and could have gotten Paul in some serious trouble. Turns out it did get Paul in some serious trouble because Paul essentially says, Gentiles, I know you're not a part of like the inheritance because you're not in the bloodline, but I want you to know when we talk about salvation, God coming and rescuing all people, I want you to know too, I'm making a declaration. Here's the good news, the gospel. The good news is you're included too. That certainly God is bigger than one nationality. Certainly God is bigger than one religion. Certainly God's plan of salvation is larger than just evangelicals, right? Certainly God's plan, when I grew up Southern Baptist, and we were convinced we were actually the only ones. And when I died, I mean, we were very clear Catholics didn't stand a chance. So if you grew up Catholic, you were way out there, all right? In fact, Catholics were worse than atheists. Somehow we had mercy for atheists, but you Catholics, like the way you tried to work your way up into it. Oh, man. And then you do your Hail Marys. Like if I just say enough Hail Marys, us evangelicals are like, you can't earn your way. What? No way. You're not in. When we get there, I'm going to look, and turns out, oh, my God, they're just Baptists here. Or I even got it so whittled down at one point, I die and I get there and I'm like, oh, it's just me. Okay, and as an introvert, I'm going, it's truly heaven. No other humans but me on an island. Woo! All right, so anyways, okay. So Paul says Gentiles. Now, just can I tell you what he says now? So if you're Gentiles, you're going, boom. Say it louder for the people in the back, Paul. You've got it. Nailed it. Okay. That's Romans 10. Keep reading the letter. Flip over to Romans 11. You flip over to Romans 11. Paul shifts his writing. And all the Jews are angry, going, Paul, you were one of us. Remember that. Paul was a Jew. Oh, by the way, Paul was an adamant Judaizer. I mean, Paul... You heard? Like, he got, like, people of the way arrested? He apparently was at the stoning of Stephen. So you want to talk about a flip. Some kind of transformation happened in his life, and he went from being, like, the vocal man of unbelieving Jews to, like, oh, there's something to this person of the way. He had an experience, apparently. They write about it in Acts twice. He falls off some kind of a horse or whatever, I think. And then it says he goes blind for 3 days, and then scales fall from his eyes. Oh, beautiful picture of awakening and enlightenment. He sees the world in ways he's never seen the world before. And all the ways in which he divided the world up of who's in and who's out just get shattered. And so Paul's like, all the Jews are like, Paul, we thought you were one of us. We're so angry at you, Paul. And then Paul's like, hold on just a second. Okay, we got the Gentiles in here? Great. Now, Gentiles, I need to talk to you. Now that I've upset these people, it's time that I upset you, okay? So I need to say something to you. Now, here's what he does. And the Gentiles are standing ovation. They're yelling. They're like, yes. But the Gentiles did something really interesting. When they found out they were in, the Gentiles, the ones who have been largely excluded, once they got included, began to actually practice excluding others. Those who were oppressed became the oppressors. Or as Nietzsche says, be careful when you fight monsters that you don't become the monster you're fighting. Isn't it weird how that happens? So, here's an example. Imagine, let's just take like our LGBTQIA plus brothers and sisters. Imagine we're at a church, we've been very adamant here, like, you're safe here. Imagine if we did that, and then imagine if those same people, the LGBTQIA, were like, we got to exclude some people, right? Wait, you were excluded forever, now you're included, but you want to exclude people? All right, so just follow me here. That's a large part of what's going on here. And so the Gentiles did the very thing that was done to them. They set up a new system of requirements. Except the requirements were no longer circumcision and keeping the law. The requirements were, hang with me, and the evangelicals mastered it, confession and believing. Oh, dear God. We've done nothing different. We haven't learned anything. We're like, listen, circumcise. So if you're in or out, we need to know. All right? Have you been circumcised? Nope, you're out. You keep the dietary restrictions? Nope, you're out. Paul's like, Gentiles are in. There are no requirements. They're in. Gentiles are like, we're in. We're in. And actually, the whole time, we're the ones who've been in. You've been out. You're out. And then the Gentiles say, but if you want in, unbelieving Jews, you need to do something too. You need to confess and you need to believe. More requirements. More requirements. They made, check this out, they made faith a work. The whole argument that Paul is making, and Luther in 1517 did a masterful job, not at a lot of things, but at this point saying, it's not about works. It's nothing you can do to earn yourself into the family of God. You just trust that whatever transpired with this death and resurrection did something about your identity. It showed us something. It transformed something. But what we began to realize is Jesus came, he died, he rose again. And Jesus didn't just come to show us who God is. Jesus came also to show us who we are. And who we are is not unlike who he is, a son, daughter, and child of God. And this is the beauty of the resurrection. When he dies, it's like he's dying to his ego, his false self, and he rises back up and he's like, oh my God, like this is who I've always been. I've just never known it. And so the Gentiles are like, I'm so grateful we're in. But then very quickly they begin to make their confession and believing a requirement. They somehow made faith a work. You must do something. You must confess. You must believe. But then that begs the question, and this is a controversial question that a lot of us sit with, and no worries if you're a guest here. You're like, are you about to finish? In just a minute, all right? This is the question then. If faith and requirement are a belief, then here's my question for all of you that's your stance. Then what is it that has to be believed? And what is it that has to have faith? And what about all those people who don't have it? Because I don't know if you know this, but there are roughly somewhere around 30,000 different expressions of Christianity alone. And each one of them think they're the ones who have the exact right belief. So some believe, well, you got to be baptized. Some are like, nope, another work. And then my favorite is the church I grew up in. They're evangelicals. They said, you don't have to do anything. But we need you to confess with your mouth and believe with your heart. Wait, hold on. You just told me I didn't have to do anything. Yeah, but you do need to do this. Wait, so they would say, Christ did it all. Great, but you're going to need to add a little something. So wait, which one? So do we do something or do we not do something? And what are the requirements for that belief? I know some people that would say you're not in unless you believe that Jesus literally rose from the dead. And I know some people in this room that are like fellow Emory grads. Did I tell you I went to Emory? Fellow Emory grads. All right. And they're very rational people, and they're brilliant, and they're smart, and they're like, come on, pastor. No one's rising from the dead. It's a beautiful metaphorical story, all right? I know some people are like, well, you're out. Because you have to specifically believe this. And then I grew up in a world where they handed me what's called a sinner's prayer. Turns out it's not even in the Bible. Not one person in the Bible ever says it. They get it right out of Romans 10, confess with your mouth and believe in your heart. Turns out this is what they were talking about the whole time, but no one ever told me that. But in the sinner's prayer, they would say, if you're going to be in, you have to say this thing and believe this thing. And so I grew up, I was saved like 10 times, 8 times, publicly. That's just publicly. I can't tell you how many times I said the sinner's prayer privately. Every flight I got on, my Catholic friends are doing Hail Marys, and I'm like, firing up the sinner's prayer. God, forgive me my sin, come into my heart, be my Lord, be my Savior. If this plane goes down, I'm good. And then I got real nervous, like, wait, but did I mean that part and not mean that part as much? Do you know what I'm saying? When it starts relying on you, it gets real fickle. So, and evangelicals have mastered this, but we're going to be careful. Like learning and teaching us to place our trust in our beliefs about God and not in God. God, I love the way I just said that. Wasn't in the notes. Brilliant. Let's keep it. Okay? All right. Let's wind this thing down right here. Let's do it. Paul shifts his argument and confronts the arrogance of the Gentiles over and against the non-believing Jews. Paul blows them away with the good news that is much better than they ever imagined. And what does he say? This is Romans 11, verse 1. Here's what he says. I ask you then, has God rejected his people? By no means. Romans 11:11. So I ask, have those unbelieving Jews stumbled so as to fall? By no means. 11 verse 26. This is going to be mind-blowing for this first century audience. All the Gentiles are going, wait, I'm confused. What's the deal here? What are you trying to say? He's like, let me be clear. All Israel will be saved. Verse 29. The calling of God is irrevocable. Paul uses words. Here are the actual words that Paul uses in Romans 11. First of all, mercy 4 times. Second, the phrase full inclusion. The word irrevocable. The phrase merciful to all. And the phrase all are saved. Wait a minute. You know the Gentiles are like, well, hold on a minute. So you have to do something. So what's the deal? Like, I don't get it. He's like, you Gentiles just made faith a work. You just added more requirements to be in. Well, yeah, but what about those who reject Jesus? What about those who don't believe? I have good news for you this morning. You don't have to believe you are a child of God in order for that to be true. God doesn't do categories of in and out, us and them, saved and damned. God's love is universal. It's irrevocable. And in my opinion, ultimately, it's irresistible. Friends, this is the best news that anyone has ever told me. I just wish the evangelicals that were driving my car just kept on going down the Romans road, because nobody ever told me Paul used the phrase full inclusion, irrevocable, and all will be saved. No one ever taught me this. It's as if Paul is trying to describe something to us. There are no in and outs. There are no us and them. There are no saved and damned. This is universal. It's irrevocable. It's irresistible in all the ways that we can say it in this moment. I want you to know I believe it's more than just a statement. I believe it's true that love does ultimately win. I believe grace ultimately wins. I believe mercy ultimately wins. I believe healing ultimately wins. I believe wholeness ultimately wins. I believe ultimately human flourishing wins. And so I close with this. The question is not, are you a child of God? That was never the question. The question is, to what degree are you aware that you are a child of God? Do y'all know the comedian Pete Holmes? He's a funny guy. He said something so profound. He said, there is nothing you can do to increase or decrease the infinite love of God. Okay, maybe some of you have heard that and you're like, right on, Pastor. And just hear that. There's nothing you can do to increase or decrease the infinite love of God for you. Beautiful. But then he went on to say this, but there are some things you can do to increase and decrease the awareness of that love for you. And so I would just say, to what degree are you aware that you are all a child of God? We've always been and we always will be. And friends, that's good news. And so if we're going to talk about salvation outside of actual liberation, then maybe the one way we can talk about it is to say salvation is waking up to who we've always been and who we always will be, a beloved child of God. And I want to tell you this, no one's excluded. Everybody is in. Okay? And just for the record, awareness that I just talked about is not a requirement. Okay? Let's not do what the Gentiles did. Well, you just need to become aware, then you're in. Nope. Hey, whether you are aware of it or you're not aware of it, the good news is you're in. You're in. Okay? Shall we close with a benediction? And here's what I'd like to do. I just want to read Paul's benediction. This is the end of that whole little riff, chapter 11. And then we're out of here. Let me say a couple things before I read this. Thank you all for coming. You've been amazing. I went like 2 minutes over, but that jumpy thing's for an hour, so they're good. All right? So just hear me. My God, if you're new around here, what a gift that we get to do this. People, I don't take it for granted. We're in the Bible Belt 18 years. I've been able to stand up here and say the dumbest things. And you are like, there's some kernel of truth in there. And you keep gathering and you keep rallying. And what a gift. The relationships that have come out of this space. Katie and I have been doing this 18 years, all of our married life. We've been married 20 years. We started really 19 years ago when we first started this space. So we've been here our entire adult life. It's all we know. It's all we know. And I wouldn't trade it for the world. My God, the profound experience of love that I've gotten from all of you is just a sheer gift. And they always told me, like a progressive space would never work in the Bible Belt, and they were wrong. It not actually works, but it's soaring. I tell people all the time, Vinings Lake, we've been bigger. We're not going to deny that, but we've never been better. We've never been better. So, for all of you new people here, thank you for being here. My wife and I are going to be right over here in the corner. Would love to meet you. If that's your thing, just come by. Like, oh, it's good to see you. I'm glad you're here. For the rest of you, you're going to pick up your kids. Fantastic. I hope you have an amazing, amazing Easter. Let me just leave us with this, okay? This is a euphoric hymn. So you imagine all of that I just shared. So then the church starts looking around, the Jews, and they start going, oh, we're all in? Now, there are probably some that are like you going, you know, I love the idea of full inclusion, but I also hate it. Because there's some people I just don't want in. I know. But aren't you glad you were let in? I know. It's how it works. It's grace. It's grace. No. But most of them, by and large, are probably in there going, first of all, blaspheme, heresy, Paul. But second, when they let it digest, you're like, that is kind of good news. And then Paul's like, I don't even know if you're aware of it or not, but I'm so fired up about what I'm telling you. It's the greatest news, and I will say it to the day I die. I'm so fired up about it. I need to end this letter with like a triumphant hymn. And my God, listen to this. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him to receive a gift in return? In the last line of Romans, listen to this. Do you want to talk about universal understanding of the divine? For from him and through him and to him are all things. All things. All things. From him, through him, and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever and ever. And everybody said, peace be with you.